Thank you, first of all, for the attention you have paid to the community of Bitonto, a city that, as we explained in the promotional video, has some very interesting characteristics. First of all, the presence of two naturalistic areas that are fundamental both at regional and national level, which marks a union between these two areas, the Lama Balice Park and the Alta Murgia Park. Bitonto is a municipality in the Bari metropolitan area that preserves and maintains this hinge road and plays this fundamental role between the two parks. There is also a very large territory interesting from the point of view of its characteristics. It is the second largest center in Apulia, an area that not only has a strong naturalistic presence, but also ancient origins that are being rediscovered. Only the other day archaeological finds were discovered dating back to the 3rd century before Christ, a real necropolis at the foot of the city's basement. A city that was founded using so-called multi-layered construction techniques, so multi-level construction. It has been built in this way from the earliest civilizations to the present day. Today, the city of Bitonto takes up the challenge of being also city center for the connection of city and countryside, which represents the majority of the territory's extension, in spite of an important historical and ancient urban core. Moreover, the so-called New Regeneration Zone joins Bari and connects as far as Altamura, thus cutting the Apulia region almost in half. Obviously, in this very interesting context, so varied, so rich, planners can invent, also the older ones can create, imagine a vision of a city that is in constant evolution and can live again and interpret the following eras. Nowadays, of course, we talk a lot about the post-COVID era in which the discovery of the natural land and the need to preserve distances and enhance green spaces plays a big role. This city is perfectly suited to this design, and the entire strategy of the municipal administration focuses on this and on enhancing the points of contact between nature and the urban center, to the point of tending and encouraging nature to invade this urban center. Initially, in the 1970s, nature was seen as a limitation because these parks blocked the city's expansion. Today, they are an asset to be protected, to be enhanced, for the purposes of the heritage itself, because by enhancing this heritage, by emphasizing its proximity to nature, we can also hope that this improved heritage can be repopulated in some areas that have been abandoned over decades. I believe that this is the most important message of the urban generation policies that have been pursued over the last 10 years, and that it is a challenge to be given to future generations, but also to this European competition in which we are honored to participate. First of all, Scuola Ingegneria e Architettura thanks Europan Italia for the organization of this event, and we are provider of the National Council of Engineers. We've been engaged for many years in training. Training is opening up to new opportunities through the involvement of young architects and engineers, professionals from other areas. This seminar Europan 16, Scuola Ingegneria, wants to promote the idea of Europe for young architects, urbanistic and landscapes through projects and cultural exchanges. Living Cities works on two types of areas. It's really time to say living cities. Both climate change and of course the pandemic situation are forcing us, as the mayor said, to overturn the vision of urban space. This edition of European wants to stress this aspect, so we selected Bitonto and Donà, two sites that have a profound relationship with the identities of the territory. Good afternoon, everyone. A warm greeting to all planners from the municipality of Bitonto and the villages of Palambayo and Mariotto. So let's get straight to the point. The mayor has well represented the reality of our territory, its particular diversity and richness, both in terms of its artistic and cultural heritage and its landscape and environment. Our territory covers over 170 square kilometers and stretches from the Alta Murgia to 2 kilometers from the Adriatic Sea. The richness of our territory, as our mayor said, also in terms of nature and landscape, is demonstrated by the presence of these two parks, which represent the link between the urban centers and the countryside. We have embraced the European project because it represents a concrete attempt and contribution on our territory to strategic planning, which should be carried out also in the light of national and other funds, such as the Recovery Fund. For the next few years, we have detected a very important theme. Our strategic area encompasses the Alta Murgia Park and the Lama Balice Park, with the entire anthropized structure that focuses on both the system of squares and the naturalistic and rural system, which today must be the key to connecting with the urban metabolisms mentioned earlier. Within this strategic area, we have our project sites, which are the system of squares. In Bitonto, the system of the three squares, Piazza Castello, Piazza Marconi, and Piazza Moro. The project site in Bitonto concerns the specific configuration of the three squares crossed by strategic axes. Clockwise, we start from Via Matteotti, which connects with the railway station, Via della Repubblica Italiana, which leads towards the Basilica dei Santi Medici, Via Giovanni XIII, which connects to the SP91, which leads towards what used to be the Marina of Bitonto, Via Crocifisso, Via Traetta, and then Via Galilei, Via Galvani, arterial roads that left the Amabalice Park. This spatial complex is unique and characterizes the urban layout, representing a crucial node both for the road system and for the structure of the city itself. We have in this three-square system Piazza Marconi, which is somewhat harassed by a series of elements which alter its historical identity. It's also affected by the parking system which surrounds the square. In this system, we also have Piazza Domoro, a very cool square in terms of colors, with a concrete pavement surrounded by palm oaks. In the three-square system, we have a roundabout with a modern layout that is precisely an invitation to revisit, remodel and review this system in Bitonto. Project sites in the two villages are Piazza Milite Ignoto in Palombaio and Piazza Roma in Mariotto. These are two much smaller squares, the one in Mariotto being slightly larger and potentially more open to other purposes, other uses, given its distance from the urban center. Piazza Roma represents a sort of stronghold between the city and the countryside. The strategic site is quite large and is the driving force for the new users of the squares. These new users, only if affected by new flows, will be able to favor the connection between Bitonto and the villages of Palombaio and Mariotto. I like to think of the two villages no longer as satellites, but as elements that are also, and above all, physically connected to the town of Bitonto. This is only possible by exploiting the linkage, the connective element that links the villages to the town of Bitonto. The element of union is represented by the parks, the Alta Murgia Park, but above all the Lama Balice Park. The villages of Mariotto and Palombaio needs to be revised, and this strategy needs to start from the city countryside pact. The fact that they are immersed in the countryside, surrounded by natural landscapes, must become their strength. In order to do so, we need to implement public facilities of the two villages to ensure that the parks become a link between the city of Bitonto and the villages of Palombaio and Mariotto. I would like to think of these facilities as distributed along the link between Bitonto and the villages. In this context, Via Cela is destined to become a cycle pedestrian pathway that will enable both citizens and tourists from all over the world to admire and enjoy landscapes that change with every passing mile. So in conclusion, I would like planners, if I may, to invest in this strategy of ours. We have already done a lot of things. Many building sites are underway with a view to urban regeneration in the logic of the city-countryside pact. We hope that this can be contribution for our city and can become support for the operational projects in the scenarios that I hope will be full of proposal and development for our territory. So what one might think when seen two villages without an element of common identity led us to understand that the keystone of the project is precisely this connection, and that we need to work on four wheels: the millstone, the tractor wheel, the bicycle wheel, and the rose window of the church. These elements recall the scale of values of the territory. So four important elements that are culture, sport, outdoor activities in nature, the traditions, including craftsmanship, and the production of the territory. Along with this rediscovery, we invited Angela Rapio, now adopted as the official artist of Europan 16 Bitonto. I will invite her to express her own idea, to visit and see her works within this path. All of this helped us understand the importance of art. Art to be used as a value within these elements, so culture and other important elements. Also, finding within the territory a series of important productive realities, we had invited Marida Milo, entrepreneur and delegate, the mayor of Mariotto village, who unfortunately she's not going to be with us during the webinar, but she told us many interesting things about the villages of Palombaio and Mariotto, where we discovered that 120 families work in the Casamila company. So now if we had to think about the physical distance between these two villages and the city, also in cultural terms, which kind of contamination would you bring from the city of Bitonto to the villages? My dream is to see this distance cancelled. How do I do it? By using the existing space. How do I use this existing space? By making the most of it, taking full advantage. Nature, the undefined space needs to be added value to our daily life. And what do I bring as a contaminating element? I transfer to the natural environment, the countryside, along the ridge, along the linkage, as we called it, between Bitonto and the villages, urban centers and the villages, and transfer their daily activities, outdoor schools, outdoor theaters, showrooms of any kind. So not only sport, but also educational activities, not only entrepreneurial activities, but also activities related to everyday life. So today, Europan is definitely a chance that can lead young architects, designers to practice on a topic that is quite complex actually. We need to create a synergy with different requests, times, the time for technical project, time for administrative project, time for strategic project. All of these requests have different timings, but this type of practice is necessary for young architects because they will always have to face this issue. I want to show you this map. This map combines different quadrants of an important part of the urban center of Bitonto, which some time ago was elaborated by my second year student to whom I assigned the topic of coordinating planning of the spaces that were part of a certain area of the urban center in a coordinated and integrated manner. This is the old center, this is the Lama Balice, that shapes the first nucleus. And then there is the so-called system 19th century from the main road to Bari. It is a very complex system of squares and spaces. This is the three square system that was mentioned, Piazza 20 Settembre, Piazza Caduti, and then the part of the Lama to go back to Piazza Castello, and it closes here. The system goes towards Corso Vittorio Emanuele on the other roads that lead to another area of the school of the fascist era. My students back then tried to create projects, an approach that should be adopted now as well, because they consider all of the directions that the city had to consider, also considering the various efforts in order to make a substantial change in urban life. What was said about the system of squares, their contemporary aspect, is the result of a lack of strategy on the topic of mobility. Mostly, mobility is an important topic without which it is difficult to provide good proposals. Today, architects don't need to invent anything because with the different plans that we have, like the plans, we have specific guidelines that have already been indicated, and architects can project their views towards a clear direction. They have to take care on the tree square, a very complex structure. This area has a great history, medieval history of the Anteporta, with the typical installations of the medieval architecture. And then there is what came with the 19th century, big outdoor complexes, space changes, and then squares like Piazza Marconi are a more classic interpretation of the 19th century square. Today we have the challenges for the cancellation of surface parking spaces. This is something that we need to do, and today it is impossible to imagine contamination with the green areas that enters these spaces. If we also consider the various areas like restricted traffic areas, slow down for pedestrian crossings, these images are the result of the spaces in a different moment. I just wanted to show you these images for you to understand how, if you free the space now beyond the project that was imagined by my students back then, look at the spaces, how big they are. For example, also the topic of alignment with respect to the routes Viale della Repubblica, roads that are typical of the 15th, 17th century. Bitonto has, per se, many characteristics of the project, not only artifacts, not only roads, but there is also a culture of the urban project that permeated some important aspects of the city's history. We indirectly
Immediatamente stiamo
answered
costruendo,
one of the
diciamo, la
questions
risposta ad
that
una
we
delle domande che
received
ci è pervenuta, la prima domanda che ci è
that
pervenuta,
asks
che
us
ci dice
what
cosa
motivates a
motiva un
connection between
collegamento
these
tra
three
questi tre
settlements.
insediamenti.
Physical distance is not always the distance in terms of values. What does it mean within the project teams? Now, trying to rebuild something that brings the great squares of the 19th century palimpsest, or one of the three nuclei, closer together. That is what we are talking about. The system of the three squares, the squares of the villages, is nothing other than the 19th century palimpsest, the form built in that era. Uniting them does not only mean creating important cycle links such as Viacela, the possibility of moving with agility, with beauty, looking at the landscape. We already said this. It also means transferring, migrating characters, elements present in one part and making them invade the other spaces too. So, to recap, memory and characters, elements migrating from one space to another. How? The quality of the project will tell. And on the other hand, also using advanced digital techniques to enhance the project in question.
quello
So what you have
che
just said
hai appena detto
puts this
inserisce questa
thematic
costruzione
construction
tecnica
within a
all'interno dei
precise
progetti.
strategy.
Poi
Then it
ovviamente
is up
ha
to each
un
participant
partecipante
to
quello di
dedicate,
dedicarsi o di
engage,
estrapolare quali possono
and
essere le
extrapolate
tematiche
what might be
interessanti
interesting
da
themes to
sviluppare
develop
e
and
quindi
then
farle
make them
diventare
part of
parti
this
della
common strategy.
strategia.
My choice to become an entrepreneur is a choice of the heart. There was this entrepreneurial activity started in the 70s by my father, who had set up an oil mill in the old family home for milking olives and then producing extra virgin oil. My father started also the marketing and created what is now known as olio quanto. As an art historian, I also thought that the beauty and cultural importance of this sector is evident. We were talking about the squares earlier. Palombaio Square has become, I agree, too much of a satellite village for Bitonto. The services that used to be there are increasingly lacking because people obviously prefer to go to Bitonto and buy everything they need. So, even in terms of services, Palombaio has the bare minimum. Life in the square has also reduced a lot. Once the square in Palambayo was the beating heart of the town. Why? Because Palambayo was born as a village with an agricultural vocation. Historically, it was a village of peasants, and the square was the center where all the issues concerning agriculture were discussed. People went to the square to hire the workers who the next day would have to go to the countryside of the local landowners to take care of the work that needed to be done. Wages were also discussed in the squares. Wages were given according to each job required. I believe so much in the identity of olive oil. Olive oil has the ability to communicate something, but in order to communicate, olive oil must express itself at its best. Earlier we were talking about the squares in Bitonto, the one in Palombaio and the square in Mariotto, and about what could unite these three settlements, which for a number of reasons have almost nothing in common. But, but there is an important aspect that shouldn't be overrated. These centers are very important because they all start from the same plant, the olive tree, which is a very important symbolic emblematic element both for Bitonto and for the two villages. The coat of arms, in fact, of the city of Bitonto has an olive tree as its symbol. One of the varieties produced here is called Cima di Bitonto. But talking about a culture of the olive tree. Keeping the olive tree as a point of reference can be an important union for these three inhabited areas that seem to be separated because each of them has its own problems and issues and evolved differently over time. So I would invest a lot on a territory because the territory, as much as historical beauties, generates beauty, and the creation of cycle path in Piacela is welcome because for tourists it's an unforgettable experience to be able to go on a path that crosses olive trees in nature. If I may add something, a symbol that is in front of us, all of us, the olive tree. Study the olive tree, the roots of the olive tree, and you will be able to understand our history. It is certainly a moment in which it is important precisely because of the multidisciplinary nature of Europan to think, to reflect on how much at this time the expression of art can tell us a lot about the territories. So for our journey, which started in the squares of Bitonto and ended in Palombaio and Mariotto, it was really interesting to come across this area almost as a chance discovery randomly. It makes us realize how important it is also to think about including these experiences within our strategic area or project sites. I wanted to link up to what Letizia said. She said something very interesting. Our territory is an agricultural area. Our beauty, the architectural beauty of Bitonto, comes from oil. We need to pursue this path. Our city was very rich, and this was due to oil. Art is undoubtedly essential to regenerate the territory, because art feeds on beauty, which is universal, able to excite, raise awareness, make people participate. Some years ago, I organized in Bitonto a project called Olion. We had artists from all over Italy, and it took place in various locations in Old Bitonto, starting from Traeta Theatre and ending in Via Rogadero, where there were some very beautiful disused premises used as art galleries, and ending with an open studio of a sculpture from Bitonto, Pantaleo Abellis, a path that ended on a olive oil mill on the Lama. The thought about art that I shared on the Europan website, Bitonto, was to understand how much the territory, in this sense, is the element that can create artistic experience. In your works, there is a lot of nature. You should consider that I come from a family of oil producers, so I've always lived immersed in nature. Or listening to the speeches to get some ideas, food for thought, both as a citizen and the planner architect in the area, also in the areas in which we work, generally speaking. I'm happy to see that finally today many of these scenarios that we envisaged are coming true. So there is time for planning and time for realization. Today, fortunately, these processes take place more quickly, and of course, while listening
interventi che
to
hanno
all
fatto
these
anche di
speeches,
grande
which have been
arricchimento.
very enriching,
Diciamo, è
it
chiaro che
is
il
clear
territorio
that
offre
the
numerosi
area offers
spunti. Abbiamo
many
parlato di parchi, del Parco della
ideas. We talked
Balice,
about the
del
parks, the
Parco
Lama
dell'Alta
Balice Park, the
Murgia, che
Alta
sono,
Murgia Park,
qualcuno ha
which
definito
have been
cerniere, che
called
naturalmente connettono
Angel's
ma
linkages that
consacrano la
connect but
bellezza e
also
l'unicità
consecrate the
della
beauty and
città,
uniqueness of the
ma allo
city.
stesso tempo
At the
sono
same time,
infrastrutture
they
verdi,
are urban
urbane,
green
connessioni
infrastructures,
verdi che
green
dovranno essere
connections that
capaci
will
di
have
generare
to
nuove
be capable
funzioni,
of
nuovi servizi
generating new
ecosistemici
functions,
collegati
new
all'economia
ecosystem
locale.
services linked
Poi si è
to
parlato
local
del sistema
economies.
delle piazze
Then
in
we talked
relazione alla
about the
città
system of
vecchia e a
squares in
questa
relation to the
lama
old
che
city
diciamo
and
ritorna
to the Lama
sempre, e
that
quindi
is always
del ruolo
present.
strategico di queste
And
piazze
therefore, the
anche
strategic
in
role of
chiave
these squares,
paesaggistica e
also in terms of
culturale,
landscapes
diciamo tutti
and
spunti che
culture.
dovranno
These are
servire per
all
ripensare
ideas that
poi
will have to
un
be used to
progetto anche in
rethink
chiave di
the
processo.
projects in terms of
Naturalmente
processes.
il territorio
Of
è
course,
ricco
the
di
territory
patrimonio
is rich in
architettonico,
architectural heritage, both
intramenia ed
intramania and
extramenia, come
extramania.
detto tu
This
all'inizio, e naturalmente
heritage
questo patrimonio
must become a
deve diventare un
centralizing
elemento
element and
accentratore e
generator of
generatore
urban
dello sviluppo
development
urbano, dei vari
and of
processi
the
che si
various
potranno
processes
sviluppare nel
that can
territorio.
be developed in
Poi
the
c'è
area.
stato chi ha parlato
Then there were
della
those
forte
who
matrice
spoke of the
agraria, un
strong
territorio che visto
agrarian
dall'aereo
matrix,
è pieno
a
di
territory
viti,
that's seen
e
from the
quindi
plain
chi
is
arriva
full of
con
olive trees.
l'aereo e atterra in
Whoever lands in
Palese
Palese
vede questo
sees this
bosco
forest of
infinito,
olive
non vede
trees
quasi
and can
l'orizzonte.
hardly
Quindi
see
come
the
questa
horizon. So how
matrice,
this
diciamo, agraria
matrix linked
forte
to the
legata
olive tree
all'ulivo
can become
possa diventare anche
also
maggiormente
more
produttiva,
productive,
ma anche legata
also
alle
linked
residenze, alle
to
famiglie.
housing
Quindi,
and
diciamo, questi
urban
elementi
planning.
del territorio,
Also,
ma anche il ricco
the rich
patrimonio di
heritage
visioni di
of
cui si è
visions
parlato, quei
that
progetti che sono stati presentati
was
prima
mentioned, those projects
dall'architetto
presented
Parisi,
earlier by
è
architect
un patrimonio
Parisi,
di
are
visioni
heritage of
che unisce
visions
conoscenze e
that combines
tradizioni, ma
knowledge,
anche
traditions, but
il
also the
coinvolgimento
involvement of the local
della comunità
community
locale, che
that
naturalmente
guides
orienta la
planning and
pianificazione e la
programming.
programmazione. Un altro spunto che è
Another
stato dato è
interesting
quello
insight
appunto del
was given
substrato produttivo agricolo.
in terms of
La
the
Letizia ci ha
manufacturing
raccontato la sua
sector.
storia, diciamo,
Letizia told
di
us
questo
her story
passaggio, ritorno alla
of return
terra,
to the land,
ma anche quello
but also
manufatturiero della
manufacturing
produzione
sector
della
of
pasta, no?
pasta
E
production.
che però sono
But
settori che
these are
dovranno essere
sectors that
capaci
must
di fare
be
sistema
able
col
to
territorio
work
e
together
con la
with the
città
territory
per
and the
generare
city
anche
to
nuove
generate
pratiche
new
sociali.
social
Questa è anche una
practices.
bella sfida
This
che
is a great
Living
challenge
City
that living
diciamo,
cities
cerca
is
di
trying
affrontare.
to
Poi
tackle.
naturalmente l'immenso patrimonio
Then,
di
of course, the
talenti.
immense wealth of
Bitonto
talent.
l'ho riscoperta come città di artisti,
I rediscovered Bitonto
di
as a city of
musicisti,
artists, musicians,
che sono stati quelli
who
che
were
mi
the ones
hanno,
who
diciamo,
enriched me
arricchito
on
nel mio
my return
ritorno da
from
Barcellona.
Barcelona.
Quindi è stato
It was
bello
nice to be able to
poter visitare,
revisit,
rivedere e
see
riconoscere il
again,
territorio
recognize the
da fuori
territory
18
after
anni, grazie a
18
questi
years,
talenti che ho conosciuto, ma
thanks
anche
to
i
this talent.
disegnatori, insomma. Quindi questo patrimonio
This
di
heritage
talenti
of
che potrebbe
talents
essere il
could be the
volano
driving
per
force to
generare una nuova
generate a
immagine
new
possibile della
potential
città e del
image for the
territorio.
city
Quindi
and the
queste
territory.
living city, quali
So,
sono le, diciamo, le
what are the
sfide
challenges
a cui ci si dovrà confrontare?
facing living cities?
Sicuramente i
Of
progettisti dovranno
course,
essere in grado di
architects, designers will have
compiere
to be
operazioni
able
di
to carry
progettazione
out
che
design operations that tend
tendano a
to
minimizzare gli
minimize
impatti
environmental
ambientali, consumo di
impact,
risorse,
resource consumption,
diciamo, affrontare temi
address
di mobilità,
mobility
ma
issues,
anche,
but also,
come il bando
as
richiede,
the
promuovere forme
call
di nuove
requires,
pratiche
promote
sociali, culturali,
forms of new social,
artistiche che
cultural, and
siano allo
artistic
stesso tempo
practices that are at the
inclusive.
same time
Immaginate
inclusive.
quest'anno la Biennale dello Spazio
Imagine this
Pubblico
year at the
racconta la città
Biennial
dei
of Public
bambini,
Space tells the
e quindi
city
come
of
queste
children
piazze si
and how
possono
the
aprire
squares
ai
can be
bambini
opened
e
up to
magari agli
children
anziani, quindi
but
le
also
città
to the
880
elderly.
come si chiamano
Cities
adesso, con il tema della
880,
mobilità, e quindi
880 in the
introdurre
theme
anche
of
elementi
mobility and
nuovi.
then also introduce new elements.
Quando
When
pensiamo
we
normalmente a
think
una città,
of a city, we
pensiamo a
think of an
un'immagine,
image. Someone mentioned earlier
dell'ulivo,
the olive
la cima
tree,
di Bitonto,
the
e
cima di
qualcuno ha parlato di
Bitonto.
arte,
Someone mentioned
quindi
art.
bisognerà immaginare quale
So,
sarà la
what
nuova
will
immagine
be
per
the
Bitonto,
new
Palambaio
image
e
for
Mariotto, per
Bitonto,
questo
Palambaio, and
territorio.
Mariotto, for this
Diciamo,
territory?
quale sarà questo nuovo brand, chiamiamolo
What
diciamo
will
così.
be our
Preferisco la
new
parola
brand? I
immagine, no?
prefer the word
E quindi
image
questa
though.
immagine,
So,
per creare
this
questa immagine, i
image,
giovani
through this
diciamo, si
image,
dovranno
young
confrontare
people
col
and those
bando,
who will have to
dovrà essere diciamo, in grado di
participate in the
immaginare
contest
una visione
competition will have
collettiva
to imagine a
che
shared collective
vibra e fatta di
vision made up of
esperienze,
cultural
come si è
experiences,
parlato prima, di
as we
esperienze
already
culturali del
mentioned,
territorio, da vivere sul
to be
territorio,
lived in the local area,
alimentate da chi
fueled by
vive
those
il
who
territorio, sul
live
territorio, quindi
in the
dall'industria
areas,
creativa
by
locale, da
the
tutto
local
quello
creative
che
industry, and by everything that is present.
questo di Europan è un concorso che mi sta
This is
molto
the
a
second
cuore
edition I
ed è la
followed
seconda
of
edizione che
Europan. It's very
seguo.
important to me, and every
Ogni
time I am
volta mi
surprised because I
sorprende perché
rediscover the ability of
riscopro le
young people
capacità dei
to
giovani di
continue
poter
to imagine and
ancora continuare a immaginare
address important
e anche affrontare oggi
sustainability
temi
issues
di
that they
sostenibilità
will have to solve,
importanti che
and for
dovranno
which a lot of
diciamo,
funding will be
risolvere
allocated,
e su cui
especially
erano
with the
tantissimi
National Recovery Plan.
finanziamenti,
I
specialmente
hope
con
that this will be a wonderful
l'Europa.
opportunity
Quindi
for
mi
my
auguro che questa
city
possa essere una bellissima
to
occasione
begin
per la città,
to open
per
up to a
inserirci
debate in a
tutti
different and
quanti
more
in modo
participatory
diverso e
way.
partecipativo.
Bitonto is in a very interesting position from a territorial point of view because it's a second tier settlement, not by the sea but in the middle of the olive grove countryside. You can imagine that in order to save the olive grove countryside around Bitonto, which has been attacked by industrial plants and a series of urban developments that do not fit in our agricultural area, we need to be very careful because around Bitonto there is a sign that deeply impressed Baroni, who was one of the author of the Bari Master Plan. It's the famous ring road, the Bitonto ring road, which is the huge circle that surrounds Bitonto and connects a series of roads that were also used for chariot races. A very strong territorial sign that says, I am in the middle of the cultivated olive groves, but there is this sign of human urbanization, perfectly geometric and centered on Bitonto, which means I want to control the territory. You know that Apulia region has been studied extensively from the point of view of urban planning. Even the legendary Kristaller, a theoretical urban planner, has studied the application of the central place theory that we started and consists in the fact that cities are naturally connected by the shortest route. The south of Salento is a further example of the application of this practice that becomes theory. So Apulia is a very interesting place. In the face of these emergencies, Bitonto has a great natural sign, the Lama Balice, which starts in Bitonto and goes all the way to Bari, a beautiful, enchanted place. I invite you to do some trekking or viewing to understand how important it is. Along the Lama and also around Bitonto, we might create this active and proactive relationship between the countryside and the city. Bitonto is a town that, all things considered, is not very peripheral. It is not certainly perfect. It is not the ideal town, but it's full of treasures. Just go to the Torrione of Bitonto and see the important historical stratification, one of the most important Romanesque cathedrals in Apulia, rich in meanings. The entire Bitonto area is steeped in signs that need to be clarified, that needs to be understood. First of all, active conservation, and then knowledge. The fact of having to connect so many places by means of a route that can be soft, or in any case done in the most consonant way possible, way respecting this territory, will be done in a specific context. Olive groves, dry stone walls, territorial emergencies created by man, in addition to nature, to the llama in this case. So it is necessary to be quite sensitive here. Local materials, mind you, are not just traditional ones, but are also recovered through a series of virtuous operations. For example, stone produces powders that can be recycled and used in 3D printing in a very natural way. The olive tree, for example, unfortunately a lot of olive trees were cut down because of Xylella. Well, so master carpenters recovered these trunks through a series of processes, absolutely correct treatments. They create the strips of wood and recycle the strips of wood. I gave you two examples, wood and stone, but you know that you have all of nature at your disposal, sun, wind, water, and this is extremely important. If you give voice to these marks, these scars of our territory due to rural culture, you should be able to reinsert in an appropriate, intelligent and active way in a new idea of tourism that can be more conscious.
Quindi
We
vediamo
hope we
di
will be able to give
spingere
the
affinché
possibility
i
to
progettisti
designers
portino
and architects
bellezza
to bring
sul nostro
beauty
territorio.
to
Quindi io
our area.
invito
And
veramente
I
di cuore
invite
tutti i
young
giovani professionisti a
professionals
cimentarsi, a darci un
to
contributo
give a concrete
concreto in questa
contribution
nostra
to this
idea
idea,
e in
to
questa
this
strategia
strategy
che parte da
that
lontano,
has
parte
started
da 9 anni
many
di
years ago
questa
under this administration.
amministrazione. Si è fatto tanto.
A lot has been done,
Si sono
foundations
gettate
have been
le
laid,
basi, quindi mi auguro che ci siano
so I
ulteriori
hope there will be
contributi
contributions that
che possano poi veicolare
can
questa strategia,
channel
trasformare
this
questa
strategy
strategia in
into concrete achievements.
realizzazioni concrete.